What's up? So glad to see you guys all here joining me tonight for Fiveable's AP Human Geography review on rural land use and agriculture. So I think that after this week, we've got one more week. We're going to look at some of the ways that agriculture has changed over time. So that's what we're going to be doing next week before we start looking at industries. All right. So taking it into that from that primary sector economic activities into the secondary sector economic activities. And you'll know what that means too, because we're going to talk about it. Most of you probably have already talked about that with their classes. I'm sure Miss Bannert has already said, hi, Miss Bannert and Miss Bannert's class. I'm so glad to see you guys here. I would love very much to see more human geography people. So if you have any other friends that need to know about what this service is doing for you, please let them know. If you find it helpful, chances are they will as well. So last week I mentioned a little bit about the idea of showing up to practice. If you're playing a sport, you'll end up at the state championship for football if you don't show up to practice along the way. In the same way, right now, ladies and gentlemen, you've got 10 weeks until the beginning of May. What that means is that your AP exam for AP Human Geography is up and coming. If your school schedule is anything like mine, I can pretty much assure you you're going to lose a lot of instructional time between spring break and EOCs and testing and all that good stuff and the prep work for all that stuff. So I'm kind of saying that to say that if you really want to make the difference between what you're capable of doing on the day of the exam, it's going to start today. It's going to start now. It's not going to start on April the 29th or May 1st or whenever you decide to start cramming. So you guys are all, I know I'm preaching to the choir here because y'all are here listening to me. But if you really want to do well on the day of the national championship, you want to show up to practice, and you guys are here. So if this is helpful for you, think about going and getting that Fiveable Plus account. All right. So I'll put it down here in the call to action, get Fiveable Plus today. That's the link that's going to take you to where you need to be. I don't have my screens and everything into the slide. I guess I never put them in. So maybe I copied the wrong presentation template. But nevertheless, you guys know at this point what to do and how that works. $20, you're going to get the full version of Fiveable Plus. You'll have access to all the past live streams that we've done, as well as stuff in the up and coming in the future where we're talking about things like we're going to be spending some time looking at FRQ practice and things like this. So it's going to be really, really helpful for you. All for $20. Doesn't get much cheaper than that when you think about it in the face of $1,200 or $1,500 for the cost of a college course. So you guys make a 5 on the AP exam. You ain't got to worry about that. So thank y'all for being here. Make sure your friends know about it. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to spend some time talking about rural land use. All right. So when we talk about rural, we're looking at a difference between rural and urban. That's the contrast here. Rural and urban. There's a difference between what those things look like. How does von Thunen's model demonstrate agricultural land use for commercial farming? Is von Thunen's model still useful today? We're going to spend some time looking at that. How do dairy farms help us to understand the application of von Thunen model? To be honest with you, we're probably going to look more deeply at that at a later date. I didn't put a whole lot in there about that topic. But that's okay. We'll look at more. What are specialty crops that has technology made it possible? Maybe I'll spend some time talking about the dairy farms. I didn't put that into the presentation. And what is a commodity change? So here we go. I'm going to make it so you guys can see the screen a little bit better. Bam. So the first thing I want to do is spend a little bit of time looking at the concept of what rural is. Now, rural as opposed to urban. When we think about rural, and we all think about agriculture. Usually agriculture is going to take place in rural environments. Not always, but usually. Rural is in or relating to or characteristic of the countryside rather than the town. Okay. So then you get thinking, if you're like me and you live in South Carolina, which is mostly a rural area, you can live in South Carolina and not realize that if you stay on the interstates. But you might say, well, is the town of Wagner, a small little town in Aiken County, is that town going to be considered more rural, or is it more urban, or where does rural end and urban begin? It might get a little tricky. What we're looking at here is an example of rural land. All right, so we know that it is of or pertaining to the countryside as opposed to the city center, and you can tell that because you've got a lot of fields, a lot of land, a lot of of fencing around it, a lot of trees, very few houses. This here is maybe a house and a barn or whatever it might be, and over here you have something similar to that. But you don't really have like towns and shops and churches and places like this that are like really, really close. And you're not seeing a dense population. So this here is maybe more like what rural looks like in a developing country. All right, so this here would definitely be a like commercial agriculture, or maybe a more developed country, what their agriculture might look like maybe the United States. And again, more of a rural example of the countryside here. And you can see the differences between the two clearly. This one here looks like surefire industrial agriculture, like we talked about a little while ago. And here you've got someone carrying a bag of, I don't know, I can't tell what kind of fruit or good that is on their head, you know. So and also the bare feet, very, very different look. So if you start really kind of dig deep into what rural and urban is, just to spend a little bit of time, because I know what you're thinking. I mean, where does rural leave off and urban begin, and vice versa? Well, the Census Bureau is going to identify two types of urban areas: urbanized areas, which are classified by 50,000 or more people, or urban clusters, which is at least 2,500 people and less than 50,000 people. Rural, on the other hand, encompasses all population, housing, or territory not included within these urban settings. Still pretty vague if you ask me, but here's the moral of the story, guys. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't spend all your time trying to ponder what in the world is rural, what is urban, what's the difference between the two, how am I going to know this in the test? The reality of it is it's all about the spatial perspective. And I say that on every single presentation. What I mean by this is the why of where. Why are things located where, or why do things follow the patterns, regional patterns, or whatever it might be that they do? And that right there is what we're looking at today. That's how we're going to sum up what rural land use is. So the go-to model for understanding, I wouldn't say rural land use as a whole, but definitely commercial agriculture, which is a big part of this, is von Thunen's model based on his writing of The Isolated State. All right, I should have put a date there. He wrote this book somewhere around the year 1800. It might have been like 1800 or 1801. Somewhere during the Industrial Revolution. Now, we spent some time talking about the second agricultural revolution a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago at this point. And the Industrial Revolution coincided with that. So he described commercial agriculture in the 1800s. That's what his experience was in. That's what he was doing. He also lived in Germany. So he described it based on the German example. His model predates many of the effects of the agricultural revolution. I don't know if you guys have done a whole lot of world history. Hi, Joseph, what's up? But what's going on here is the Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain first, same as the second agricultural revolution. So when this starts in Great Britain, it was in the mid 1700s. So by the year 1800, you still see the concepts of the Industrial Revolution diffusing throughout Europe and also into the Americas, and people are playing catch up. So that said, Germany was in the midst of the Industrial Revolution at the time of von Thunen. I say that because I'm going to come back to it a little bit later. It's going to have something to do with whether or not this model still applies. Also, von Thunen takes into account there is a set number of assumptions. Okay, so what do we mean by that? There's a saying about assuming things, right? And I'm not going to say it on Fiveable Plus, but on Fiveable, but that pretty much what you got to think about with assumptions is that they're not always necessarily rooted in fact, or they're not always 100% true. So with any model, and I think this is my next slide, no, but with any model you're going to look at, there's going to be it's going to be designed to show certain phenomena or certain characteristics that occur in the right conditions. You guys might already remember, you've talked about several models already, especially in the population unit. So you looked at the demographic transition model, and we see these picture-perfect little lines that represent the decreasing birth rate, and then later on the decreasing death rate, and how we say that in stage 2, the population is going really fast, and in stage 3. But if you look at how that model applies to individual countries, the lines may look a little bit more squiggly as time goes on, or whatever, because the model is going to take into account certain trends, but isn't necessarily going to capture the way things are to perfection. And that's what you need to know about the von Thunen model. So let's look at these assumptions, and we're going to break down the model and talk about what the point is, what was it trying to do, and how can we use it today. And this is where we're going to spend most of our time. When we're finished with this, we are going to look at commodity chains, which I wanted to talk about some last week, and then we'll try to apply this. We're probably going to have a little bit more time at the end than we usually do. I don't anticipate that I'm going to go the full hour this time. Who knows? I say that loosely. You never know. All right, so here are the assumptions. Von Thunen's model. One, there's only going to be one market. One market. So this would mean that if I live in South Carolina, our biggest our capital city is going to be Columbia. So let's pretend that Columbia is our one market in this entire state. So screw all the other cities, just one market. The model also is going to assume that farmers produce goods for sale. All right, so we're looking at commercial agriculture. I've already mentioned that earlier. We're looking at an isotropic landscape. What the heck does that mean? Oh my gosh. Anybody know what isotropic means? Actually, I got it kind of defined right there, don't I? Remember, we look at topography or topographic maps, or maps that show the topography or the different variations of the Earth's surface. Well, according to von Thunen's model, there are no topographic variances. Everything is going to be isotropic. Another way of looking at this is the uniform landscape. So sometimes you might see it called the uniform landscape. All right, meaning the same thing as isotropic. Everything is the same. So when it's isotropic, what it means is that you're not looking at you're okay. So people are having no. So when you look at isotropic or uniform landform, there's no rivers, there's no mountains, there's no roads, there's no railroads, there's no mountains, there's nothing that's going to get in the way of point A and point B being the market, point A being wherever you are. And that's really what number 4 is. All points make a direct path to the market. All right. And then number 5, the assumption is that farmers are looking to do what makes the most profits. Okay. So there are always going to be variations to this, but for the sake of the model, let's go with it. And here's what we get. Well, actually, before we get to that, what you're looking at here is I took a picture of my fine state of South Carolina, and here is Columbia. All right, here is West Columbia, St. Andrews, a few others, Dentsville. Dentsville, West Columbia, Casey, Springdale, Lexington, somewhere over this way. These are all different cities, but for the sake of this model, we're looking at just one market, right? So that one market would be Columbia. The other thing that you notice right off the bat when you're looking at a Google Earth view, and this is South Carolina, but you can look anywhere and see this, is that there are definitely topographic variances, and there's a lot of them, right? So you got the Congaree River right here. You've got all these roads, all these this area, it looks like very rural area, and then more cities and other places. Remember, with all models, and here's what I was just saying earlier, with all models in and outside the discipline of APHC, they don't necessarily explain how things are, but how they would be under specified conditions. And those assumptions are the conditions we're looking at. That said, here's the kicker. Models are important for helping us understand why we do certain things on the whole. The demographic transition that we just mentioned from population. That helps us to understand how we respond to essentially having enough food to not die when we're kids. And in terms of our total fertility, which, if we live longer, we eventually will start having less kids. Also represents economic growth. While von Thunen's assumptions aren't really all that legit, and we'll look more at that in a minute, the model isn't about topography as much as it's about how we respond to economic conditions. All right, so farmers only care about profits in this model. They're going to try to minimize costs as much as they can. Now, this here is really important. So the first thing we talked about with the model was the assumptions, okay? The second thing we really got to point out is that when von Thunen was looking at how farmers are going to behave in relation to the market, they're going to do it on the basis of how much things cost. All right. So you take, when I took economics in college, I didn't do very well in economics in college, to be honest with you. I wish I could go back and retake it. I'm sure it'd be a different story. But the one thing I remembered from my first time in college economics is that we were reading a book. We were reading an economics book written by Gregory Mankiw. And one of the things that he wrote was the 10 principles of economics. And one of those was that costs are going to be saved by reducing marginal costs, or I guess profits made by reducing marginal costs. So what farmers are going to do is they're going to try to reduce the cost of production, because you're not really going to do a whole lot with the cost, or I guess with the profits you're going to make off of the good if you can't cut the costs. So they think about two costs according to this model. One, the first cost is the cost of transportation. All right, that's important. The further you are away from the market, the more the cost of transportation is going to be. And secondly, they look at the cost of land. So sometimes you're going to see this called bid rent, or just rent, or whatever you want to call it. But some variation of that, that means that the land is going to cost something from the farmers. And even though von Thunen assumed that all the land was going to be exactly the same in terms of its richness, in terms of its soil quality and all that, it's going to be different in terms of its cost, depending on where it is in relation to the market. So basically, there's a distance decay pattern between the cost of land and the distance from the market. All right. So can you explain or re-explain intensive and subsistence farming? Yes, we will. Yeah, let me do that in just a few minutes when I get done with talking about, actually, as we talk about the von Thunen model, that's going to be applicable. So give me just a few minutes on that. If you want, you can put it down there in the ask a question, and then it will be stamped and time marked whenever we look back at the presentation later on, if you're Fiveable Plus. But yes, Vikram, we're definitely going to take a look at that in just a moment, because it definitely applies. In order to maximize profits, farmers have to make decisions about what to produce in relation to the cost of transportation and the cost of land. All right. So wheat is going to be an extensive. Here's why you're asking. Wheat is going to be extensive, meaning it requires a ton of land. So last week we talked a little bit about intensive and extensive farming. Intensive farming is going to be a huge amount of work and energy and labor put into a small amount of land that's going to produce a ton of food. So we talked about intensive in the form of intensive subsistence, which is seen in LDCs, and it's really backbreaking labor like rice farming. And there's also going to be commercial intensive, which would be more like maybe a dairy farm, which is not a super huge piece of land, but they produce a huge amount of product for people with a huge amount of input. And what I mean by that is it's not going to be backbreaking labor done by millions of peasants, or I guess a ton of peasants, but it's going to be a lot of expensive capital machines that are used to produce that output. All right. So extensive is kind of the opposite. Extensive requires a huge amount of land with a relatively small amount of work put into it. So that's really what the difference is. So when you think about wheat being extensive, let's see. So can you slow down a little to get notes down? Yes, I'll try to slow it down a little bit. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I'll try to slow it down. All right. Sorry about that. I get so into it, I can't help myself, right? Okay, so that's really what extensive and intensive is when you're looking at the way that that farming is done. So when you think about that in the context of the model, milk is going to go bad really fast. Remember, this is the 1800s. This is not, we don't have refrigerated trucks and things like that, right? So milk is going to go bad if it's really far away from the market. So you want to have your dairy producers really close to the market, right? And we just said that dairy is also going to be considered to be commercial or intensive commercial farming. So does it make sense to have your dairy farm super far away? Does it make sense to have your lumber super far away? Because we know that lumber is wood. You cut down trees, you make lumber out of the trees, and that's what you're going to build things out of. That's also what people in the 1800s were still using as a fuel source, because, I mean, yeah, we're going to get around to using oil and things like that, but we hadn't gotten there yet in the 1800s. So usually things like lumber and things like dairy farming and things like fresh vegetables these things would be done really close to the market because otherwise they're going to perish. So when farmers make decisions like this, Von Thunen's model shows that they would tend to locate in a geospatial pattern with relation to the market. That's the basis for the model. There's the model. All right. So you've got your urban center. We just talked about this being the one urban center according to the model. Von Thunen doesn't have multiple markets. Sorry, just the model assumes there's one market. And really that's for simplicity's sake, right? On the outside, the first ring, if you will, of his land use model is going to show dairy farming and market gardening. All right, so last week we talked a little bit about agricultural regions. And I mentioned that because of modern technology, things like this can be transported over a huge amount of space without going bad, things like refrigeration. But back in the day, it was pretty close to the market because otherwise it'd go bad or it'd perish. What's the point in having flowers or vegetables or tomatoes if you can't eat it because it went bad before you got to the market? Next, you've got your forests. Okay, so we don't really think about forest as, or I guess foresting so much as agricultural activity today because we don't rely on wood the same way that they would have back in the 1800s. I mean, today we have electricity. Today we have gas and different types of fuels that we use in order to warm our houses or in order to cook our food or whatever it might be. So we don't think about forests as so necessary, and they can be way further out today than what they would have been back in the 1800s. All right, but back then, the reason why you'd see it so close to the market is simply because if you're looking at transportation costs, carrying lumber, or I guess transporting wood from a forest to make something out of it and sell it to the market is incredibly expensive. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but we're going to learn a little bit more about a bulk gaining industry whenever we start looking at industrial geography in a couple of weeks. But the idea here is that the heavier something is when you go to transport it, the more it's going to cost to transport it. Simply put, it's kind of got that relationship. So with forest, I guess wood being so heavy and so hard to transport, it's going to be close to the market, especially because back in the 1800s it was necessary in order to warm your house or in order to cook your food. Grains and fuel crops are going to be next. Now, what we're getting into here is we're getting into this extensive agriculture. All right. So what I mean by that is, like I said, it's going to take way more land to produce your grains and fuel crops. Plus, and here is another key, because remember, it's not only going to be the cost of land, but also the cost of transportation. The cost of transporting this is going to be cheaper because even though you get a ton of grains in a wagon, it's going to cost a ton of money, or it's going to be heavier, is what I meant. But they don't go bad. So you can transport the grains further without it going bad, like you would with dairy farming, when dairy or fresh gardening or things like that will go bad fast. So that's another reason. Now, one thing that I have not pointed out just yet, and probably should go ahead and make some time to look at, is that the land closest to the market is going to be more expensive because it's closer to the market than the land way out here. All right, so that's another part of the relationship. It's just like today. You go looking at some of the most expensive houses in the cities nearby where you live, and they're going to be right in the downtown area or real close to it, because that land is in tighter competition with other businesses and other residents that want to be a part of that. Where you think about what cities are, they're clusters of people, and they're clusters of businesses and services, and so land is in high demand where all these things exist. So in the same way with Von Thunen's model, the closer you are to the market, the more expensive the land is going to be. Now, finally, way out here, you've got ranching and livestock. Wait a second, Fowler. What happens whenever you slaughter animals and you transport that meat? Because won't the meat go bad before you get it from way out here to the market? Well, yeah, it probably would. But here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. Animals are dumb, right? You can tell the animals you're going to kill them, But here's the thing, they'll sit there and walk themselves all the way to the market. Then you kill them in the market. And then all you got to do is sell the meat to people fresh when you get there. So that's part of the reason why you would see your ranching and livestock way out here on the far outer ring, because the animals will walk themselves to their death. You slaughter them when they're in the market. Then you get to sell your fresh meat. No refrigeration required. All right, I know that's probably pretty gross, but that's the reason for it. All right. So what we're looking at here is a super complicated, mathy looking graph. All right, you guys math people. To me, I'm not very much of a math person, so it looks like a very complicated, graphy looking, mathy looking graph. But really, it's pretty simple in terms of what you're looking at. So remember, you're looking at land close to the market being the most expensive. The further out the land is, the less expensive it is. But the further you get out, the more the cost of transportation is going to be. So what you're looking at here is a graph. You can call it a bid rent curve if you want to. And what it is it shows the cost of land on this side, and it shows the distance from the market, which is going to be associated with the cost of transportation on the x-axis. So y is rent, x is distance from land, transportation. And so what you end up seeing here with this chart is where the lines occur here, where they intersect is going to be the point where farmers are going to no longer do vegetables and they're going to do wheat based on those two costs. All right. So I wouldn't take this and super overcomplicate it, but if you're looking at the model the way we did, and this right here is the market, this is the first ring, which it would be vegetables. It would also be dairy. All right. It would also be market gardening of any kind, or flowers, horticulture, any of that stuff. Where these lines, where this line intersects with this line here, is where you're going to see the transition from vegetables to wheat. Now, once you get into the wheat circle, the land is going to be cheaper, all right? And the distance is going to be further, but we already know that wheat won't spoil in the same way that vegetables and dairy will. So you're able to carry it further without the loss of profits. That's the key. So where this line intersects here, that's where you're going to see it no longer profitable. And farmers are all about that profit only, according to the model. This is where farmers are no longer going to do the wheat or the grains, and they're going to do cattle farming or livestock. All right. And they're going to do that all the way up until you get to the outside of that. And believe it or not, there is going to be a point on the outside of the city where people aren't going to go anymore. And according to this, and there's no outer ring here, maybe there should be, but everything that's on the outside of the ranch and livestock, von Thunen called the wilderness. Okay. It's not the same as the forest. It just simply means that there is no land or life out there because we're looking at one market and everything centers on that one market. All right. So that's the way it would have been explained. So, and I should have shown you this. All I did here was circle the lines where they intersect, which means that, like I said, at this point, it's time to do wheat. At this point, it's time to do cattle. And once you get here, you're on the wilderness side of the market. You're no longer near enough the market to really be a part of it. That's the reason why he called his book the Isolated State. That's the name of the book that von Thunen wrote and talked about this model. All right. So that's all well and good. This model is great. The thing is, today we have modern transportation, right? Today we have multiple markets, and we have multiple cities with huge populations, and we have fast transportation with refrigeration and things like this, with interstates and trains and even planes and shipping containers and things. We can get stuff transported for a huge amount of distance. So can we really still use von Thunen's land use model to understand how we do commercial farming today? And it's debatable, but the first thing you have to do is you kind of have to adapt the model to match what's going on today, all right? So those assumptions that we looked at earlier, you really have to kind of play with them and tweak them some. So automobiles, like especially trucks, refrigeration, which can be put into trucks, they're going to be major game changers. We also know that there are rivers, mountains, and roads, whereas maybe mountains might get in the way. We know that sometimes you can use navigable rivers to increase the ability to do transportation. roads are going to help, especially if your infrastructure is good. A few weeks ago, we talked about infrastructure being like the communications and road networks, the buildings, the quality of all these things are known as infrastructure. So if you're in the United States and you have really good roads, relative, I guess, as opposed to like developing countries, then you can get things from one place to another with way more speed and efficiency, and also the other markets. Here is a modified von Thunen model. And so you can see this a lot. This is in the Rubenstein book as well, if you use the cultural landscape. But what you're looking at here is von Thunen's original model, right? And this here might be what the model looks like if there is maybe a river, and you might have a sub-center. Taking into account there might be another city. It might not be as big, but there's definitely another city, perhaps, that could maybe change and alter the model. Notice that this river is considered a navigable river. I struggle to say that. But what this does is it enhances and extends the market gardening and firewood and lumber and all these different types of crops that usually would be really close to the market center. If you have a river that can increase the transportation and make it cheaper and faster to get things from one place to another, then you can see that you can extend that area away from the market. And that's interesting to consider, right? So people have taken the von Thunen model and have already looked into making it more modern in terms of just taking into account the topographic variation. Excuse me. Okay, so in reality, many features together determine what the agricultural activity is and what will be done and where it will be done. All right. If a river made transportation easier or cheaper, all right, the ranges of agricultural activities could go further, as you just now saw in the model. Some climates aren't going to work with with certain crops. All right. So no matter how close they are or aren't from the market, you're going to see them located somewhere that doesn't necessarily make sense. I'm going to show you that in a minute as well. Some regions have a comparative advantage, kind of along the same lines, to produce one thing over another. So what do I mean by comparative advantage? I think today is the first day of the CrossFit Open. I don't know if you guys follow CrossFit or are doing any of that stuff. I did CrossFit for a few years. It was fun. It's super expensive. But let's say that one of the workouts that you're going to do is something that you just have to deadlift, like, I don't know, 325 pounds 10 times before you move on to 5 rope climbs. Well, I'm pretty small. I can climb up and down a rope pretty quick. I'm not very good at doing deadlifts with 325 pounds. So what I would do is if I'm going to decide, hey, I need to modify this WOD, I'm going to work out with someone. We're going to share the reps. I might get Big Gus, who's 300-pound weightlifter. He can just easily do the deadlifts. I might let him do the deadlifts, but he's big, so he can't do the rope climb. The point I'm trying to make here is that from a comparative advantage standpoint, it makes sense for me to climb the rope and for Big Gus to lift the weight, right? That's a basic economic concept. So applying this to economics, some countries, some regions have a comparative advantage, meaning that they can better produce a certain crop or a certain good than another country or region can. So when you think about some climates don't work with certain crops, you would see that region produce something else, and a different region would produce what we're going to call specialty crops. We'll look more at that. There's also no such thing as a one market state. There are going to be multiple markets. They're going to be different sizes, and they're going to vary just like anything else. So farmers are going to adapt to that. And as far as transportation innovations go, we can get things from one place to another place super far away because of things like refrigeration. So when you think about von Thunen's model and you want to apply it to a way bigger region as a whole, you can look at the United States and make some pretty decent connections to the way agriculture is done according to the model. So let's pretend for a second that, and we know that we've got Chicago and we've got LA and all these other cities in between, but we know also that the largest, I guess, the most populous city in the country is New York City. Okay, so if you say that the market is centered on New York City, by the way, also in this area, the New England states is the most densely populated region of the United States and even of North America. So it makes sense that the market would be this area right here. So when you think about where is the dairy farms nearby, the Great Lakes, this here is the dairy belt. You think about Wisconsin's cheese. There's a lot of milk and cheese products being made in this dairy belt region along the Great Lakes. You've got your wheat belt, your corn belts, all these different grain growing areas in the kind of the Midwestern states. And then further to the west, we already talked about these agricultural regions. It's very dry. You can't do as much farming, so you have a lot more of your cattle ranching. So you can already look at the United States as a market and kind of draw these rings like von Thunen would around different regions of the United States and apply the model to the US as a whole. Now, that right there is interesting because you don't think about maybe the way you can make general assumptions or correlations to a model that was created in 1800 to describe how they did agriculture commercially, but you really can look at that and make these assumptions. So if New York City is the only market, you see vegetables and dairy and all that really close. You start seeing a little bit more extensive the further down you get to the point that you're doing straight up extensive agriculture. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit different looking than what the model is, but still close enough that you have to kind of scratch your chin on it. Now, if you kind of modernize and look more so at the way things actually are and kind of take into account those belt regions we were just talking about, yeah, this here is where you're going to see most of your dairy. This is where you're going to see a lot of corn, a lot of soybeans, cotton and tobacco, your vegetables, your wheat, beef, and cattle. It's really very similar to what you might see over this way as well. We also know that over here on the West Coast, you've got a huge population of people as well. Not as many as you have over this way on the eastern side of the country, but still a large population. So it makes sense that you might have certain types of dairying in California. Happy cows come from California. That's not showing up here on the map, but it's true because that's what you see on the commercials, right? California is a huge milk producing country. But the thing I really want to point out here is these specialty crop regions. All right, now that's interesting. So what do we mean by that? Well, according to von Thunen's model, your vegetables, your market gardening, your dairy is going to be as close to the market as possible because one, usually these are going to be intensive commercial activities, and two, it's going to your ability to sell these things for profit is going to depend on proximity to people that are willing to buy it before it spoils. But because of the climates in these areas and because of modern transportation, they have a comparative advantage, like what we just talked about, to produce certain specialty crops. Now, we talked about this last week. This is a Mediterranean climate. All right, so they're going to produce things that aren't going to be able to be produced in other parts of the United States anywhere. Things like grapes and olives and things, stuff like this that's associated with the Mediterranean climate. Tomatoes, those things. With Florida, we all know Florida oranges, right? I mean, if you drink any kind of big deal orange juice, it's gonna come from Florida. I mean, and if Florida has a hurricane that wrecks all the oranges, you'll spend $8 a gallon for your Tropicana orange juice. Man, I wish that was cheaper, man, because I just can't afford it anymore. But the fact of the matter is, these are specialty crop regions. You're not going to see oranges being grown anywhere else in the U.S. You're not going to see these Mediterranean crops being grown anywhere. So if we want them in the market in New York City, we're going to have to get them from these regions here. And we can do it because of modern technology such as refrigeration and trucks and roads and good infrastructure and trains and things like this, and get that stuff from one place to another. Right? So that's key. When you look at the wide where of agriculture, it's going to depend on a lot of things. And in this case, you can have the biggest market all day long over in this area, but if the climate won't let you grow it right here, you're not going to grow it there, especially if there's a comparative advantage. In other words, if it makes more economic sense to grow it in other areas due to the amount of money you'd be able to make doing that. And it just is. So maybe you can still look at von Thunen's model and say, I think that dude had a point. Maybe. You can also still look and find other holes in it, but it's worth looking at because it helps us to understand spatial perspective, the why of where. Okay, so the other side of what we're going to do today, and it took me 40 minutes. You know what? I might just go an hour yet. Holy mess. So, probably not, but pretty close. When you look at commercial agriculture, in the way that agriculture is done in developed countries, it's changed so dramatically. Commercial agriculture is still today largely about maximizing profits. Not always, because we talked a little bit about the GMO debate, right? And how maybe even with consumers, maybe it's more important to consumers more recently to buy organic food that's not modified genetically. And people might be willing to pay more for this, or buy local, which they might pay more if you have maybe an urban farm that's trying to sell to the local restaurant. So you can't assume that commercial agriculture is always about maximizing profits, but usually that's a huge component. Large agricultural corporations must use technology in order to meet the demands for crops that come from specific regions and nowhere else, such as your specialty crops. So what we're looking at here is we're going to look a little bit beyond commercial agriculture in the United States, which would be very kind of similar to what's going on in Europe as well. But what we're going to do instead is we're going to look at this region right here. And we talked about this. This here is your tropical agriculture regions. We looked at this last week, so go back and look at it if you hadn't already. And buy Fiveable Plus if you hadn't done that too, so you can actually go back and look at it. But if you look at this, the tropics, you got the Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn. These green colors that occur in there, these are tropical crops. You can't get them in the United States by growing them naturally because they don't grow well. So what are some of the examples of these crops that we get from the tropics that we can't live without? Oh, snap. Oh, I couldn't imagine South Carolina without sweet tea. But man, if you weren't getting that junk from somewhere else, we probably wouldn't be getting that junk. Things like cocoa, things like coffee, things like sugar. Holy crap, I just made a deep connection. I drink coffee every morning. I ice that junk and I put sugar in it, and I put milk in it, and I put cocoa in it. Man, of 3 of these things on my list, I eat 3 of them every single morning. What in the world would I do if there wasn't some way of being able to get those tropical crops to the United States? Here are some maps that kind of put that in perspective where these things are being grown. All right. So cocoa in the tropics, tea, or I guess sugar. This is sugar in the tropics, coffee in the tropics. Wow, we're screwed, right? Thank goodness for globalization of the economy and for our interconnectedness made possible due to technology and technological advances that enable us to get our goods from these regions. So things like cheaper transportation, things like good transportation networks through strong infrastructure and refrigeration technology. All right, so when I look at cheaper transportation, I wrote down shipping containers. I probably should have put a picture of this. We're going to look more deeply at shipping containers when we look at industrial geography. But these things come out like I want to say they started to get big maybe in the 1980s. Definitely by the 1990s and early 2000s, you start to see these big uniform containers that really are the basis of the way we do shipping today. So part of the reason why you're able to get stuff from clean across the world for relatively cheap is because you can put anything, big or small, in these containers and ship it cheaply from a Chinese port to Charleston or to Jackson or wherever it might be, and not Jackson, Jacksonville, and be able to get these goods in the United States within a month, usually for relatively cheap. I know that my brother makes gaming controllers. He's a big gamer. He'll play fighting games like Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and all that. He makes these fight sticks. He gets most of his components for that from some Chinese store because shipping is next to nothing. I say that because, did you give Bay, to go back straight to the 2010s, did you give Bay some flowers on Valentine's Day? They may have come from another country. Holy mess. Holy mess. Unless you grew them yourself, the roses, mums, or hydrangeas you see probably came from South America. They were cut in massive greenhouses, wrapped in a plastic sleeve branded with Whole Foods or Trader Joe's name, and flown 1,500 miles to Miami on a fleet of dedicated cargo jets. During the peak season, 30 to 35 fully loaded flights per day take off from Colombia most landing in Miami. Who'd have thought that the flowers I picked up for $15 at Walmart came from Colombia? Yet, with globalization and transportation networks the way we have it and modern technology, yes, that's exactly where they probably came from. I'm not saying you don't have local gardeners, but that do these things, but a lot of these Walmarts and things like that will come from another country because we can. We can better understand regional interdependence across Earth by looking at global commodity chains. Now, this right here is key. So we're talking about this interconnectedness. We're looking at how technology and transportation networks and infrastructure kind of help us to be connected when it comes to agriculture. But really, when it comes to getting something from one place and having it as a finished product on your dinner table, that refers to how, when we talk about that process, we're looking at commodity chains. Sometimes you will see this also called a supply chain. As far as I know, they're pretty much exactly the same thing. So a commodity chain, this comes from Wikipedia, is a process used by firms. So we're looking at more or less agribusiness to gather resources, transform them into goods or commodities. A commodity is something that can be bought and sold, and finally distribute them to consumers. It's like a series of links connecting the many places of production and distribution and resulting in a commodity that is then exchanged on the world market. All right. In short, a commodity chain is the connected path from which a good travels from producers to consumers. Let's break it down. So what you're looking at here is a graphic that shows a commodity chain of a cocoa bean, right? So cocoa beans grow in pods on trees, and they don't grow in places like the United States. We already looked at that, right? Cocoa beans are going to grow here in the tropics, in Latin American countries, or in some African countries, or in India somewhere. So you're going to have farmers growing it in these areas. They're going to harvest it in a very special way. They're going to let them ferment and dry. There is a cool video. Man, if I didn't put that video in this, then I'm certain I did. I put it in here. That shows what this process looks like. There's a cocoa bean market. So these guys are going to take their dried, ready to sell cocoa beans. They're going to take it to a market where they're going to get paid by individuals, usually in a process called fair trade. We're going to look at it a little bit later. And from there, the cocoa beans are going to go to a packing center where they're going to be packed for transportation. They'll be put in these big burlap bags and thrown in a shipping container. Now, they're shipped overseas and they're brought into a roasting and grinding facility. All right. From there, it's going to go and get processed and then sent to whatever company is going to use it for making candy bars or Nesquik, whatever it might be. And then from there, it will be put into a store on a shelf for you to go and buy and have with your coffee in the morning, or with your Valentine's Day sweetheart, or whatever it might be. That right there is the commodity chain, y'all. The process by which all this stuff occurs so that we can get it whenever we want it. This is another way of looking at, I think, the same thing. The reason I put this in here is because it does show what I mentioned as fair trade certification, which is super important, because when you think about, and here you have a cooperative, okay? When you think about things like a co-op or fair trade, what that's talking about, or what we're looking at here, is an effort to promote higher incomes for producers. Because one thing, and I should have put it in here, one thing that is, you think about when you look at the way that we use farming in the tropics, these farms, or I guess these cocoa, coffee, sugar, and things, mainly cocoa and coffee, they're not being consumed by subsistence farmers in the countries that are producing them. Quite the opposite, actually. What's happening is these countries are producing these goods so that they can sell it to rich people that have the money to buy it. When I say rich people, I mean people in Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. So these are luxury crops, all right? One thing that we try to do today is we want to, I guess as a world, or maybe at the United Nations level, we want to kind of end this legacy of colonialism. And today, a lot of times you think about the concept of neo-colonialism, which is, yeah, we don't still exert political power directly over countries, but we impose our will over countries, perhaps through things like certain types of trade deals or certain types of let's say we want coffee really bad, so we're going to find a way to get it. And there might be some degree of exploitation in this process that makes it look like old imperial countries still haven't totally let go of their imperial possessions. Now, it's ludicrous to think about imperialism in the way that it would have existed in the 1800s, but people who argue that we kind of take advantage of poorer countries when it comes to our own economic needs, they kind of have a point. So what fair trade is a process by which we can ensure that people who farm these goods that we buy into aren't getting ripped off in the process, because we're looking at their livelihood. My livelihood is to teach. Something I like to do on the side is to come and teach you guys AP human geography reviews with Fiveable. But I don't feel like I'm really getting ripped off like that, and I don't think that's going to really be possible in the system we have. But when you go into a country where they don't have a whole lot of political power or a whole lot of economic power or anything, you want to ensure that they're getting the best bang for the buck. And this is something that, as far as I know, is mostly consumer driven. So consumers will look for labels on bags that say this is a fair trade product, and that way they know that when they buy this, they're not supporting some, I don't know, unethical practice or something that puts people's lives in danger by using bad agricultural practice. I went to a Starbucks roasting facility. We have one of those in South Carolina, just down the road from Columbia along I-26. When you think about the why of where, it's located along the interstate, maybe not even quite 2 hours away from Charleston, which is the big port in South Carolina. Once they get the coffee beans in burlap sacks, very similar to the cocoa commodity chain, they will roast those coffee beans and then distribute them via truck with other stores or other places throughout the Southeast. And so we were there talking to these people running that factory, and Starbucks doesn't use fair trade, but they still have a process that is very, very similar to ensure that they're not, that the farming practice is ethical. They're trying to make sure that whenever something, they try to preserve coffee by replanting trees and things like this to try to help support, I guess, good practice of what am I trying to say? Taking care of the environment by you can't say recycling, but that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that they will replace things that get lost through disease or whatever. They try to teach farmers how to better farm. It's really, really cool. I was really glad to be able to be a part of that and see how that happens from their standpoint. Very, very similar to fair trade. So here is just a quick graphic that shows a conventional supply chain, very similar to what we were just talking about. I think this one is looking at coffee. And again, you've got the fair trade mentioned in here, which is, like I said, designed to make sure that people aren't taken advantage of. Here's another infographic that talks a little bit about fair trade. 71% of consumers use fair trade mark to decide whether or not a product is ethical. 83% of consumers who have seen fair trade mark trust it. So just a bunch of stuff that talks about how consumers view things on fair trade. The most widely sold fair trade crops are going to be coffee, tea, bananas, and chocolate. And definitely coffee, tea, and chocolate are the ones I would remember. They're also luxury crops that we are serious about consuming in the developed world. So the last thing that I really kind of wanted to talk about a little bit, and I can't believe I just forgot to put it in, was dairy farming. And so maybe what I'll do is probably next week I'll try to start with that and look a little bit more at that in more detail, because we definitely want to talk about how technology has improved. That we've kind of already looked at. We'll start with that. We'll spend just a few minutes next week talking about that. That way I can let you guys go because I have almost gone my full hour. But I wanted to end by showing you a few of the resources. And these are YouTube links. So if you Google, I guess if you go into YouTube and you type these titles exactly like you see them there or close to it, you absolutely will get those showing up in your search. The 5.4 von Thunen isolated state is a Dan Snyder video. He does a very good job at breaking down the model, and also talking about the specialty crops, kind of like what we were looking at earlier. The cocoa sweet value chain shows the process of the commodity chain of cocoa. And then the journey of the coffee bean does the same thing, except looking at the commodity chain for coffee. I would definitely look at these two right here. If you don't look at the top one, that's great. I would look at these so you have enough insight to know what they look like in case you're asked a question on the AP exam where you need to explain what a commodity chain is through, I guess, from the spatial perspective standpoint. So our quick summary, we looked at these things. Rural land use can help us to understand the why of where. Von Thunen used a model to show how farmers respond to land transportation costs. Von Thunen model can be adapted to show current patterns of agriculture in the regions like the US and Europe. Technology has made globalization and regionalization of agriculture possible. We're very interconnected because of that. And commodity chains explain how goods start in one place and end up on tables in other countries through a refined economic process. So that is all I got for you. And I'm very, very glad y'all stayed with me and stuck it out. Tell your friends about this. If it's helpful, the live streams are as free as can be. Later on, we're going to be getting into some types of test-taking strategies and things of this nature. At some point, it's going to be really, really beneficial for you guys. So if you want access to the old stuff, go and get the Fiveable Plus account. And if y'all have any questions for me, anyone have any questions for me? Tell your people about it. Get on your social media. Let your friends know. Let your teachers know. Thank you, Miss Banner and Clash, for coming and joining me. And if you guys have teachers that could benefit from seeing this, or offering extra credit to other students, or tell their students that, hey, this is helping me, let them know. Let's get the word out. I'll see you guys later. Thanks a lot for joining me. Oh, good point, Joseph. Sorry, I should have started with that. No, we're gonna pick back up with that, but no, we're not gonna do it this week. I meant to tell you all that at the beginning. I think it's a really cool idea. We're definitely going to do that in the future. All right, so it might look a little different, but yes. So last time was kind of a trial. I thought we were going to hit it up this week as well, but we're gonna take a break and come back to that. So stay tuned. I promise it's coming back.